Hey, what's up? Hey, it's who's this? I see you in here pretty regularly. I see some people trickling in here. I'm just doing about an hour of QA today. I'm gonna set a stopwatch for myself. Let's see. Hey, good morning, guys. How's it going, Bliss Ham? Thanks for popping in. Yeah, just doing some kind of. So here's what I'm thinking. As I'm playing with live, and I'm playing with how often I want to go live and like how I want to structure it, things like that. I'm thinking I kind of want to do like Monday through Friday in the morning go live. Um, I'm kind of thinking that's what I want to do. I'm still working out like how often do I want to open up the floor to have guests on like I did yesterday, and how often I want it just to be like a QA. Today's probably just going to be about an hour of QA. I may reserve the times that I go longer and have like guests come on and have discussions with. I may reserve that to times where I have guys like Exploring Reality and Job and people like that come on. Someone says, "Good morning. I love your videos. They literally affirm my faith." I'm so happy to hear that. That's what I'm here for. That's what I'm hoping to do on TikTok. I want to hopefully broaden people's understanding of things regarding Scripture and maybe clear up any doubts that they had or things like that. Blizhem said, "I liked how you had those guests in yesterday. Very interesting discussions." Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. I'm sure we'll be doing more of those in the future. Um, Dalton Amerson said, "What are your thoughts on Christmas and Easter?" Christmas is a Christian holiday to celebrate the birth of Christ. Easter is a Christian holiday to celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus. I know that there have been some suggestions by opponents of Christianity saying that these things are pagan developments or things like that. Inspiring Philosophy has done some really good videos specifically addressing those claims, which I would refer you to. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with celebrating them. Someone said, "Do you think the devil used that story because he knew of Jesus coming to deceive us?" What story are you referring to, Topsky? Let's see. I'm gonna broaden out this. Yeah, to someone. What was your? I'm gonna see if I can scroll back and find it. What story are you referring to there, Topsky? Why were some early Christians anti-Trinitarian? Well, I don't want to psychoanalyze anyone and say, oh, they were, anti-Trinitarian because this or that. But it may be the same reason that some people are anti-Trinitarian today, which is that they think it undermines monotheism, or they think it undermines, scriptures in the Torah that talk about God's unity and there being only one God. It may have been that they thought it undermined that, but I don't want to psychoanalyze them. It'd probably be best to just read their writings. So, for instance, in modern anti-Trinitarian Christianities, guys like Tuggy, he just doesn't think that the New Testament data supports the idea of a Trinity. I think he's completely wrong, but if you really want to know why they believe that, you should go read them, because you're not going to get an unbiased account from me. The Egyptian story. Oh, I take it you're referring to my recent video, Topsky, about Horus. Yeah, I just don't think that there's that many similarities, if that's what you're referring to. I just don't think that there's that many similarities, or really any, that are significant in any way between guys like Horus and Jesus. And the similarities that actually are there are so like bottom of the barrel. Or it's like one of the similarities was Horus had a dad, Jesus had a dad. It was like, well, okay, like then now you can draw similarities between anyone, like me and some guy on the other side of the earth. Well, we both have eyes. Like, someone says, "Does the Bible condone slavery?" No, I do not think it does, and I think objectively, it was the Bible that led to the abolitionist movement, because people came to recognize that, if the Bible teaches and Christ teaches that we're all made in the image of God, well, this whole chattel slavery thing is really not appropriate. Do you know every time we breathe, we speak the word of God? I wouldn't go that far. Someone said, during creation, God said, "Let us create man in our own image." I don't know what he's referring to there. If you're asking about why it says us, I think that There's two ways to interpret that. Some people say that that's an indication of the Trinity. I think I would probably go with another explanation, which is that he's just referring to the angels that are there with him that he also created. Yeah, so feel free to put questions in the chat. Just doing some general QA. What if some people say they don't believe in God because he is westernized? I think that's the question there, Sophia. Well, I would say that if you understand the origins of Christianity, that's insane, right? Because Christianity originated in Jerusalem. It's in the Middle East. But also, the idea of God is not something that's fundamentally Western. That is something that is pervasive all across the world. And so, if they want to say that Christianity or belief in God is a Western notion, I would challenge them to support that. And then I would also put forth the obvious data, which is that no, Christianity isn't a Western religion, unless you want to try to, I don't know, do some backflips there and try to say that the ancient Greco-Roman world is, or the ancient Jewish world is Western in nature or something like that. Someone said, "Amen. Love your videos. Thank you. I appreciate you." It says, someone says it gives instructions on how to own slaves and treatment. Yeah, so I think it's important. Several things to know here is that in the Old Testament, the word slave, it doesn't usually have this connotation that's out in modern times of chattel slavery. What's referred to in Scripture as a slave in the Old Testament can also refer to, or I think is more accurately referring to something like a servant, someone who serves another, something like that. And that was also often something that was done voluntarily. You could sell yourself into slavery, which is more like indentured servitude to pay off debt, things like that. The slaves had rights, certain protections, things along those lines. So I think to look at something in the Bible that's translated to the English word slave and then try to import into that all these concepts of colonial, like chattel slavery, I think is mistaken. You need to look at the ancient Near Eastern documents in their context and also how it was specifically used in the ancient Israelite world. Someone said, "Do you acknowledge that demonic spirits inhabit the ocean?" I don't think so. I don't know any reason to think that that's the case. Someone said, "Great work spreading the gospel on TikTok." Thank you. I appreciate it. Someone said, "Acknowledging the Trinity." I don't know what that is in reference to. Someone said, "Why did the God in the Old Testament say he's a jealous God?" Yeah, I think that God says in the Old Testament that he's a jealous God, in the sense of that he is the only one who is deserving of worship and honor. And when we as humans go astray and worship other deities and ascribe to those other lesser deities worship that is only appropriate to God, I think it's saying he is angered over that, and that he's jealous. He wants that for himself. And it's important to know that it's only Yahweh, it's only the Almighty God, the Most High God. It's only Him who is worthy of those worship and that praise. And it's also for the good of mankind to worship Him. It's not just some selfish thing. It's going astray after these other deities, I think, leads us into sin and death. So I think there's a lot of stuff going on there. Someone said angels don't create anything. That's fine. That doesn't contradict my understanding of Genesis, saying God saying this to the angels. But even then, I mean, I don't know. It depends on what you think the angels do. Whether or not, it depends on how you think the history of the universe unfolds. If you think it's gradual, things like that. But yeah, and then like I said, if you really want to take that position, then you can say, okay, well then God's referring to the Trinity there. Someone says we aren't made in the image of angels. That's true, but the question is, are angels made in the image of God? And I think that's an interesting question that maybe isn't as clear as some Christians think. I think there might be a case to be made, depending on what you mean by the image of God, that maybe angels in some sense are in the image of God, and that they are representatives of Him. They are delegates that He uses to do things just as we are. But maybe you might think, as I think is plausible, that Christians are made in the image of God in a sense that angels aren't. But yeah, so that's the question, is are angels made in the image of God? And so, I don't know. Yeah. Someone said Jesus never existed. I talked about that in my last video. That's an insane claim. Someone says, why doesn't Jesus show himself? I think he does. There's a good number of people who convert to Christianity through experiences, whether it be dreams or visions or miracles of Jesus. I think he's still revealing himself to people to this day. And we have a good amount of really bona fide Class A miracles of Christians praying for people and them having miraculous healing. And in a lot of parts of the world where Christianity is kind of going against the grain or where it's in the minority, that's one of the primary ways that people come to the faith, is through this type of miraculous works. And not a super in-depth account of it, but Craig Keener in his work on miracles, his 2-volume work on miracles, gives kind of a broad overview of kind of the reputation of miracles in other parts of the world that I think is worth taking into account. Someone said also angels wouldn't have existed before the first day. It depends on if you're taking a really literalistic interpretation of scripture there in Genesis, which I'm not super confident is the right way to go. Someone says, how can angels assist God in creation? That would limit God from being the only creator. Again, I'm not sold to this idea of saying that angels helped God create man, but let's suppose, for an instance, that one really wanted to commit to that idea. Do you think angels assist God in anything? Just in general, does angels assist God in anything at all? If you say no, I'm going to say, well, then why in the world are there angels? Like, what do they do? I think the obvious thing we get from Scripture is that they assist God in things. Now, I'm not saying that angels they are helping God in the creation of man. I wouldn't go that far. So that's what I would respond to there. Someone said, dude, you're clueless. I disagree. How come Muhammad had correct prophecies? I don't think he did. If someone says that Muhammad had correct prophecies, you can ask them what they were. A lot of times they're the most incredibly vague, just like off the wall thing that you could think of. So let's see. Some of these I've already addressed. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat. I'll be happy to respond to them. What do you think about Gnostics? Good question. So Gnosticism came about after Christianity, as I mentioned in my last video, around the late 1st century. I think it directly contradicts what we see in Scripture, and I think it has no basis for its claim to truth, and so I think it should be rejected. Someone said, do you think we should switch the Old Testament textual basis of modern Bible translations from the Masoretic to the Greek Septuagint? Not necessarily. I would just leave that up to Old Testament textual critics. That's not my field. I don't know much about Old Testament textual criticism, but I would leave that. So in general, for instance, like with the New Testament we have as a text is a critical document. It comes about from comparing the various manuscripts that we have together and using all that information to create what we think is the most accurate rendition. Yeah, I think that should probably be what we do with the Old Testament. It's a little bit more difficult with that than the New Testament, I think, but yeah, I'll just leave that up to the Old Testament textual critics. Someone said, why did God say he hated Esau? I would say that the language of hatred there is not to be interpreted as literally hating someone, like not loving them. I think that that's hyperbolic kind of black and white imagery or sayings to say that's God's way of saying he's chosen Jacob and has rejected Esau. And I think if you look into the language there and you read some commentaries on that, I'm pretty well within what we know about Hebrew culture and writing practices to say that. I think that's how that should be interpreted, is that that's the way of God saying he chose Jacob and rejected Esau. Let's see what else we got here. Someone said, how do you feel about Christian priests molesting kids and then still getting into heaven? So I would say two things there. Obviously, any type of sexual assault is wrong, regardless of who it's coming from. And if someone is doing that and they're misusing their priesthood to have that, have that power to abuse people in that way, I wouldn't be super confident about them getting into heaven. So I'm not sure I would say they do. Someone says, I'm a believer, but don't call myself Christian because some Christians' behavior is embarrassing. Is this okay? I don't think so. Because two things, right? Well, if no one who, if you don't be, if you, let's say you behave well and you don't call yourself a Christian, well, then how are we going to change this reputation, right? If everyone who didn't behave poorly did what you did, we would be leaving the name of Christ to those who are degrading it. And I think the way you combat a bad reputation from Christians is by embracing that name and by showing what we should displaying the behavior that's representative of Christ. And I think we see in New Testament verses, I think it's Peter saying, I'm not ashamed to be called a Christian. And so as it would say, it's problematic to, I think we should be embracing the name of Christ and not being ashamed of him. Do you know that Jesus in English is Jason, Christ in English is Bach? I don't know where that's coming from. What is the purpose of your faith? It depends on what you mean there. So, purpose of my faith, in a sense, I want to have accurate views about the world, and I also think it's through faith that we're saved. So on one hand, the purpose of my faith is I want to have an accurate view of the world. I want to understand our history, how that affects me existentially, things like that. But I also want to put my faith in Christ because I recognize that it's through faith in Christ that we're saved. So someone said, bro, please make a video on the flat earth claims. Man, they are so ridiculous. I was actually thinking about doing that this morning. Just still thinking about how I want to end up tackling that topic there. But yeah, I was actually watching some stuff and doing some research on that earlier. If anybody has questions, feel free to put them in the chat. So let's see. Someone says God exists. Hard agree. If you have questions, put them in the chat. I'm scrolling through looking for. Someone said imaginary friends only reveal themselves to those who imagine them. Well, this is assuming that God is an imaginary friend, which I don't think is the case. I think if you look at I think we have good arguments of natural theology to think that God exists. And this has been the default position for pretty much all of humanity. And it's also worth noting that a lot of people convert to theism and to Christianity because of the evidence. So for instance, what's his name? Anthony Flew was a committed atheist for most of his life, and then towards the end of his life, he converted to theism because he thought that's where the evidence lied. So it's pretty disparaging to make comments like that, even if you think that theism is wrong. Someone says we were once angels. I wouldn't go that far. Let's see. Someone said, well, the notion that angels helped God create man, I think, is based on the notion of the divine counsel. It could be. I want to make clear, I don't know of any scripture off the top of my head that indicates that scriptures helped, or that angels helped God create. And I think there are some scriptures that indicate that God alone created. And so I want to be careful there. But that would be a more nuanced topic that I would want to have with nuance and not kind of off the cuff here. Someone said, with all the things they added and removed from the Bible, why didn't they remove Psalms 137:9? I don't know that off the top of my head. Someone said, let's see, Exploring Reality says Sky Daddy doesn't exist. You got me there, Than. Let's see. Someone said Muhammad says Muslims would conquer Egypt and Persia, and the Levantine, and they all did that within. I imagine they said that's within a certain time frame. Cool. So if America says that we're going to conquer the Middle East, and then we go in and we conquer the Middle East, is that a prophecy that shows that the president of the United States is a prophet? Don't think so. The Muslims had a growing amount of military power, and just because they conquered someone and said they were going to conquer someone before they did it, that wouldn't imply that they're therefore prophesying. And I mean, I would have to also look at the specific. I would have to look at the specific quotes there. I mean, if that's coming from the Hadith, I would be very, very skeptical about that because of the late date of the Hadith. But that's just kind of like my off the cuff response to that is like that's not quite as strong as an argument as I suspect you think it is. Someone said, what do you think is the Christian stance on self-defense? Do you think it's murder? No, I don't. I don't see any biblical basis for saying that. Than's getting roasted because people don't know he's trolling. Someone said an answer to the Psalms 137:9 question. I don't know what that is off the top of my head. And since you didn't provide any context for why that might be removed, you're welcome to add that in which case I can address it there. Yeah. Yeah, so what do you think is the Christian stance on self? I already answered that. I'm saying credit doesn't make sense. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Let's see. Someone said, do you think women should wear head coverings? No, I think I talked about that in the last live. I think Paul's remarks about women wearing head coverings is due to the cultural considerations in that society in which women not having head coverings could be seen as, what's the word? It could be seen as promiscuous, or it could be seen as inviting people to adultery. It could be sending signals about one's sexual desires. It could be sending wrong invitations, and because of that, in the Christian community, it could be a source of controversy. So I think Paul was addressing. A specific controversy there and encouraging people not to do things which would call their Christian brothers and sisters to stumble. Craig Keener, in his work Paul, Women, and Wives, talks about that more in depth and gives examples in ancient culture of how a woman's hair could be seen as how a woman's hair in ancient culture could be sexualized. Someone says, except you believe in fairy tale? No, I don't think I do. Someone says faith literally means believing without evidence. That's never been what Christians view faith as being. And if you just look at the original disciples, they did not believe in the absence of evidence. They saw Jesus performing miracles. They saw Jesus performing miracles. They saw him after his death. They ate with him after his death and resurrection. We're told that Thomas, touched his side, or was offered to touch Jesus' side. I think they had good evidence. And even if you think that these stories aren't true, even if you think they're false, it can't be accused that having faith means believing something without evidence when these people, if the story is correct, had evidence. That's just simply never been a Christian understanding of faith. Someone said, let's see, some of these I've addressed. Someone said Christianity is okay if you ignore the supernatural nonsense. Well, the problem here is that you're assuming that the supernatural aspects is nonsense, and that's also the core of Christianity. So, yeah, someone screams God does not exist. I disagree. Some of these I've answered. Someone says God is very imaginary. Bro, I disagree. I think we have good reasons from the field of natural theology and also from history to think that God exists, that he created the world, and that he's intervened in human history. Someone said, what evidence? Sure. So I think in the field of natural theology, someone asked what denomination I'm in. I'm not currently in a denomination. I kind of fall in between the cracks of Catholic and Orthodox and Protestant. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. Someone says, what evidence, lol? I'm assuming they're referring to my evidence about God. So within the field of natural theology, there are a number of arguments that have been put forth for why we think that God should exist, apart from any type of divine revelation. These include things like Kalam cosmological arguments that argue that God is the cause of everything. God is the cause of the universe. God is kind of the first uncaused cause in the causal chain. Things like the teleological argument, which argue that God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning that we see in the universe, and that it's this kind of when we look at the universe, it seems like it was, in a sense, prepared for life in this very fine-tuned way, this very improbable way that it could come about. So an argument from a teleological argument would argue that God is the best explanation for that. There are moral arguments which argue that God is the best explanation for how we can have objective moral knowledge and have objective moral duties, things like that. Then there are historical arguments like the historicity of the resurrection. There are arguments from miracles. If you want to see a good academic look at all of those, I highly recommend the Blackwell's Companion to Natural Theology. It's quite academic, quite rigorous in tone. In fact, it may be too academic for some of the people in this audience, in which case Something like Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview by William Lane Craig has a good section on arguments for God's existence. Someone just keeps on screaming, there is no evidence of God. I disagree. Someone mentioned Lee Strobel. Yeah, Lee Strobel wrote a really layman-friendly book called The Case for Christ, which I've read, and I think it's a pretty good... it's a good lay introduction. I mean, he doesn't go super in depth in some areas, but I think it's written well. I think it's entertaining to read. Like he presents it as a narrative, and I think it's been really influential. I don't dog on that at all. Someone said, why don't the main people of the Bible have books in the Bible? I'm assuming you're talking. I'm not quite sure what you mean there. Someone said, how do you have so much faith? Well, I think that as I study the natural world and as I study philosophy and history, I just am overwhelmed by, I think, the amount of evidence for the truth of Christianity. Someone says, do you think prayer works? Yes, I think it does. I think we have instances of people being miraculously healed by prayer. So yeah, I think it does. And I also think that prayer isn't just meant to get us something that we want. Prayer is used to offer praise to God. It's used to offer gratitude to God. It's used to build a relationship with God. And prayer shouldn't just be seen as a means of, hey, I want something, or I want to get healed by something, do it. So let's see. Someone said thoughts on Mormonism. I think Mormonism as a whole is wrong. I think that we have good reasons to think that it's false. So the early Mormonism as it was taught by Joseph Smith directly contradicts Scripture, and I don't think we have any good evidential reasons for thinking that they're correct. So I think Mormonism should be rejected. That said, I think there's a lot of Mormons who probably have a view of God and of Jesus that is not super different than Baptist, even though Mormon doctrine is very, very different than, Orthodox Christianity, there may be Mormons who are not aware of that past or maybe reject it. And so that's just to say, don't lump them all into one bunch and then treat them as a monolith. Make sure that if you're talking with someone, you are hearing what they're saying, hearing their beliefs, things like that. Some of these I've answered. Someone says, how come there are books removed from the Bible? That's a good question, and how you answer that's going to depend on where you lie on the kind of Catholic Protestant divide or the Orthodox Protestant divide. There was the removal of the books of the Bible, from my understanding of history, come about around the time of Martin Luther. And I think the best way to kind of say, well, okay, why were these removed is I think I think Luther didn't like the doctrine that was taught in them, and so he wanted to remove them because of that. That might be a bit uncharitable. My Protestant friends might want to come back and say, well, no, like there was some disagreement about whether or not these should have been canon in the first place. But I mean, at least from what I can see of history, the books in the Bible that were removed under Luther, they seem to have a pretty prominent place in Christian history. So I think Luther was probably wrong about that, but I'm not firm on that view. But that's just what I see from doing the history of it. I think that, I think that was mistaken by him. Let's see, I don't have much thoughts on Jonathan Edwards. I think I've read some of his work, but I'm not super familiar with it. Someone says, can you please entertain my question? I'll try my best. I've got 99 plus new messages down at the bottom of my screen. I'm trying to scroll through and answer what I can. I'll be on for about another 30 minutes. Someone says, do you think we should wear head coverings? I already addressed that. Chris Turner is asking, why don't the main players in the Bible have books in the Bible? Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean. I mean, I think a lot of the main players do have books in the Bible. Are you saying why don't they have books in the Bible that are named after them? Well, if we're looking at things like, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, who are all major players, they do have books named after them. But if you're talking about like, okay, why don't we have the Gospel of Peter? Well, we do have books in the New Testament named after Peter. If you're saying, why don't we have a book written by Jesus? Well, Jesus wasn't writing. He was preaching, and it was his followers who took what he said, wrote it down, and passed it along. So without more nuance there, I'm not sure that I can give you a better answer. I think we do have main players in the Bible who have books in the Bible, unless you're asking, why don't they specifically write it? And maybe that's just not what they were interested in. Was the Trinity mentioned in the Old Testament? I think in the Old Testament, we do see how do I phrase it? I think we see different there being multiple persons in the Godhead in the Old Testament. Whether or not we get a full-fledged Trinity, I won't go that far, but I do think we see the idea of this two powers in heaven. So there was a book written called Two Powers in Heaven that specifically talks about how there was this idea, even pre-Christianity in Judaism, of there being two powers in heaven, and we get that really explicitly in Daniel 7 when the Son of Man is brought before the Ancient of Days. So yes, I do think that we see I do think we see in the Old Testament foreshadowing of what eventually becomes the full-fledged Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Someone says, what age were you indoctrinated to believe man-made fairy tales? I was never indoctrinated to believe man-made fairy tales, so that's a really easy question. Thanks for posing it. Let's see. I'm going through answering questions. Someone says religious people lack critical thinking skills. That's why they are so gullible. This is really nothing more than an ad hominem attack, and it also ignores the fact that many of the greatest philosophers and scientists of history have been religious people. So it's both rude and wrong. So that's an impressive combination. Someone says, why don't Christians study about science? Many do. I think a better question there is, why don't more people in general study about science? Yeah, lots of Christians study about science. I've done studies about science as it relates to my own interest in things like cosmology, biology, things like that. Yeah, and I think there's lots of very prominent Christian scientists. So yeah. Someone said, struggling with my faith, what helps you hold on? The thing that helps me hold on to my faith is just, I think it's true, right? At the end of the day, even when I'm struggling and maybe I'm in a bad emotional place, I reflect on the knowledge that I have and the data I have to think that Christianity is true. And it's like, it's one of those things where it's like I hold on to it because I know it's true, and I know that if I rejected it, that would be intellectually dishonest of me. I could not, in good, if I was to try to walk away from the faith, I would know in my own mind that I would not be following what I knew to be true. It would be an emotional or just a spiritual rebellion on my part. And I also don't have, the desire to walk away from it, right? I think through my desire in life is to bring glory and honor to God in everything that I do, and to help others to come to know Him, which is why I'm here. So, someone said, if Jesus isn't white, why does the Western U.S. Christians keep depicting him as such? Is that okay? I don't know why some people have depicted Jesus as white. Honestly, I wouldn't lump all Western/U.S. Christians together in that. As myself and most other Christians I know, if you ask us, is Jesus white? Should he be depicted as white? We wouldn't say that. Yeah, you'd have to ask the painters who made those pictures why they chose to depict him in that way. Someone says, have you taken any world religion courses or study in seminary? Yeah, so I did a master's in theological studies, and I had a world religions class in that. Let's see. Someone just keeps on asserting that there's no evidence for God, and I disagree with that, obviously. Someone says, why do you worship a violent God who kills infants, children, and animals? Well, I think that I worship that God because he is morally worthy of worship, and I think I have good reason to think that the times in which he kills people, he's morally justified in doing so. And at the end of the day, picking things out of context from Scripture and trying to demonize them is not a successful argument strategy. If you want to come at me, the adversary, I would encourage you to actually present arguments against my position instead of just characterizing Christianity in this way. Someone said, are you aware of the atrocities perpetrated by Christianity? There have been people who have used Christianity as a means to justify doing morally bad things, but that does not affect the truth of Christianity. Christianity has to be assessed on the truth, on its truth value. Does it correspond to reality? And then we would have to look at the specific evidence there. Someone said, if there was actual evidence, everyone would believe. Really? Because about a couple years ago, we had a pandemic that swept the world, and yet we still had people who chose to reject the reality of that situation, despite the fact that there was an overwhelming amount of evidence for that. We have people who reject the existence of and the historical accuracy of the Holocaust, even though, again, we have an overwhelming amount of accuracy for that. We have people who reject that the earth is round, even though we have an overwhelming amount of evidence for that. So if you're a really big argument against thinking that there's evidence for Christianity is that if there was, everyone would believe it, you seem to be up a creek without a paddle. Let's see. Someone said favorite Christian apologist, C.S. Lewis. I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan. Other than that, probably William Lane Craig. I think he's great. Someone said take a history class. God and religion were made up to control people. There's absolutely no historical evidence for that. And in fact, if you actually, did any historical investigation, you would see that people believed in God because either they had experience of him or because they came to rationally conclude it as a type of reflection. For instance, if you read like the Platonic works or something like that, there's this idea of believing in God because it's where their evidence leads them. So it's ironic that you say take a history class when actually all of history and anthropology rejects that idea. And there's no evidence to suggest that sometime, somewhere, some guy was like, I just need to control people. I'm going to make up this God guy. And that just took off. That's historical nonsense. Someone said, I don't have preterism. I don't hold to that, but I don't have much. I'm not knowledgeable enough to talk about that in depth. Someone says, is Hebrew trustworthy as it has no author? This is a really good question. I think so. So Hebrew is a book that we see it being used very early on in Christian history and in Christian tradition. We see it being recognized as authoritative. And I think because of that, we can take that as trustworthy. That's my answer there. I think we can take it as being trustworthy because of its extremely early use by Christians. Christianity is just believing, not actually backing up that Jesus is God. There's only one God. No, I disagree. I think a lot of Christians have backed up the idea of Jesus being God. For instance, William Lane Craig in his doctoral work that later became the source of a lot of his material that he uses in public debates, argues for the historicity of the resurrection based on historical data. Mike Licona has done similar things, though in a different way. Guys like Tim and Lydia McCrew argue for the historicity of the resurrection and the reliability of the Gospels. So this idea that there's no backup for that is insane. Someone says Aquinas or Van Til. Probably Aquinas, because Van Til is precept, and I don't like precept, although I don't like Aquinas' Thomism. Someone says, why is your religion the right one? Because I think my religion has evidential support that other religions don't have. So, for instance, if you watch my channel, you'll know that I think that there's lots of historical or internal issues with something like Islam. So, for instance, Islam comes 600 years after the birth and death and I think resurrection of Christ, and it directly contradicts earlier eyewitness testimony. And so I think that there's problems there. Just the kind of short, simple, quick answer there is, why do I think my religion is right and another one is wrong? Is because I think I have good reasons for thinking that my religion is right and others are wrong, and that Christianity has evidence that other religions do not have. What does Christianity have that Islam doesn't? An accurate depiction and understanding of the person and works of Jesus Christ, for one, and also an accurate reflection of the character of God, for another. Someone says thoughts on Van Til. I'm not a huge fan of presuppositional apologetics, so yeah. Do you think someone who defended themselves would be held to have committed murder in God's eyes? No. This idea, I think, is talked about in the ancient Torah. If someone's breaking into your home and you kill them in self-defense, I think based off. Yeah, that's not murder. I don't know of any religious system or legal system that considers that murder. I mean, I'm sure there are some out there, but I see no issue with that. And I don't know the verse off the top of my head, but I think there are sections in the Torah that specifically address that. God is only and only. Christianity is idolatry. No, Christianity is an accurate reflection of God's actions in reality. Someone says, what are some arguments for heaven/hell existing? I think arguments for that would come largely in two separate ways. One would be to argue for the reliability, to argue for the authority of someone like Jesus, right? So, for instance, me, I would say, well, Jesus taught that there was heaven and hell, and I think I have good reasons for thinking that Jesus is divine and has, the authority and knowledge in that area. And so I think I could argue based off Jesus saying those things. But I also think that we have good evidence coming from near-death experiences who people have, they die, and they experience hell/heaven like experiences. And what a lot of people don't know is, I'm sure all the trolly atheists in this chat are about to have an aneurysm about me citing near-death experiences, is that near-death experiences are actually an extremely well-documented thing in the medical literature, and there are entire peer-reviewed journals dedicated to discussing them. And yeah, there's a lot of really great research out there to think that these are some bona fide spiritual experiences that people are having. So yeah, let's have people lose their minds in the chat about that. Someone says, let's see, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I have about 20 more minutes. Someone says, why do we have to deal with Adam and Eve's sin if we don't do none from the start, lol? I would say you have to deal with your own sin. The idea of original sin isn't inherent to Christian doctrine, but at the end of the day, you have your own sin, and that has to be accounted for. Someone says, I wish you would stop ignoring my question. Bro, there are like 50 people in here. I have 99 plus new messages, and half the time it skips over a bunch of messages. So maybe have a little bit of degree of charitability in dealing with me here. I've got a lot of people asking a lot of different things. Someone says, do you know whose spirit was in Jesus? Yes, the Spirit of God. The Holy Spirit, I think. One way to belittle those with listening to you with no background to their knowledge, or way to belittle those listening to you with no background. I don't understand what that's saying. Someone says you didn't give one piece of evidence. I didn't explicitly spell out the arguments here, but I gave resources. For instance, the Kalam cosmological argument, I think, is a good argument for thinking that God exists. The teleological argument, I think, is a good argument for thinking God exists. So, for instance, if you look on YouTube of like the work of guys like Luke Barnes, Robin Collins, Alexander Pruss, William Lane Craig. If you watch any of William Lane Craig's public debates, I think that is a good way to get a taste of the evidence that I see for Christianity. Someone said you should go back to school and study science. You'll leave all your indoctrination behind. That's funny, seeing as how many of the most prominent scientists in the world are Christians, and that historically science itself began through belief in God. So I think it's ironic you would say that, and it shows actually your historical and scientific ignorance to suggest something like that. Someone says, which Catholic teachings do you agree with? Yeah, I think it's fine to pray for the dead. I think I'm pretty sympathetic to the idea of asking saints to intercede for you. I'm not 100% sold on that. I kind of go back and forth, but I'm not super antagonistic against that. But I think tradition's really important. I think Catholic and Orthodox, the emphasis that and the way that they incorporate Christian history into their practices, I think is really useful. So there's kind of an overview there. Let's see. Someone says, do you know whose spirit is in John the Baptist? We're told the Holy Spirit. Someone says, thoughts on Van Til? I answered that. I haven't read much of his work, but my understanding is that he's a presuppositional apologetics guy, and I'm really not a fan of presuppositional apologetics. Someone said, how do you feel about the pseudo-pictography? I'm not familiar with that. Someone said, why did God only speak to men, no women? He didn't only speak to men, no women. Christ had a number of women followers, and after Christ's resurrection from the dead, the first people he appeared to were his women followers. Let's see. Someone said, what do you have to say about the Catholic Church abusing children more than any organization in the world? I would say that that's really wrong, and they should get that under control. I'm not a member of the Catholic Church. But yeah, I would say that that's wrong, and they should deal with that. Someone said, should I pray to Jesus or to God? I think Jesus is God, and addressing your prayers to Jesus is fine. Addressing your prayers to the Father is fine. Someone said, thank you for answering. Yeah, let's see. I'm scrolling through. I'll be on about another 18 minutes if anyone has questions. Why does Christianity need to exist? This is a real weird question. Christianity is a word that's used to describe a set of beliefs about God and the person of Christ. In a sense, if the beliefs that they hold are true, Christianity needs to exist. I don't understand this language "need to exist" here. It's a worldview. It's a set of beliefs, and I don't understand this idea of talking about need to. Right? We should be addressing, is this true or not? Someone says, are you aware of the differences between the biblical Jesus and the historical Jesus? I'm aware that people have tried to drive a wedge between the biblical Jesus and the historical Jesus. I'm also aware that these attempts fail horribly and are unsuccessful, and so I would reject those type of distinctions. Someone says, you seem to have memorized basic apologetics rather than reasoned your way through this. No, I have reasoned my way through this. It's just the fact that you are going to just keep on calling me an idiot rather than actually I'm presenting any type of substantive reasons for not, for me. You have not presented any substantive reasons for me to reject my faith. And I have studied philosophy and science and history on these topics, and I think that the evidence supports my position. And I've talked about this more in depth in other lives that I've done. And yeah, I'm not going to sit here and rehearse all those now because this live is going to be more of a QA. But yeah, I don't think I've just accepted basic apologetics here. Let's see. Viscasco asked, why do you keep ignoring my question? Why didn't they remove Psalms 137:9? Why would someone remove Psalms 137:9? Like, I don't understand the question. Someone says, you're only answering the easy questions, dude. Let's go. Okay, I'm addressing questions about slavery, about women's position in the Bible, about people accusing me of, being an idiot, things like that. Someone says, and the same guy who says that I'm only answering the easy questions is repeatedly asking a question that I've already answered. I've already answered your question, DP Davy. What do you think? You asked me, what do I have to say about the Catholic Church abusing children? I would say it's wrong that people in the Catholic Church have done that. I don't think it's an accurate reflection of everyone in the Catholic Church. And I'm not going to be repeating this answer again if you fail to listen to it. Someone says, nope, the Trinity was not mentioned in the Old Testament. I disagree. I would say see Daniel 7, which I think is a pretty good representation of the two powers in heaven. Someone says, Jesus comes from a Middle Eastern country. Why are these countries Islamic? I think a lot of Middle Eastern countries are Islamic because Islam came in and killed people who disagreed with them. Yeah. Are you aware of the Bible specifically talking about three gods? No, this is wrong. If you want to make that accusation, you're more than welcome to go for it. Someone says, how can God be all-knowing, all-powerful, and completely benevolent? I don't see a contradiction there. What about those three things is supposed to cause me trouble? Let's see. Someone keeps asking about Psalms 137:9, yet I'm asking you, why is that something that should be removed? I think that's something that was written by the psalmist. Christian or Judaic tradition is meant to preserve what was written, not to just go through and change it. So if you're going to suggest that we should expect this to be removed, I'm asking you to elaborate on that claim. Yeah, DB Dave just, I think, needs to turn up his volume. I've addressed his question literally twice. Let's see. Someone says, why do you worship a God who kills children? I don't think that God goes around killing children willy-nilly. I think that there are instances in which God has killed children or allowed them to die, but that he had morally sufficient reasons for that. I worship God because I believe that he is a being who is worthy of worship, and that is through worshiping him that I can come to have a relationship with him. I've answered this multiple times. Someone says, what do you think the true gospel is? I think that we have an accurate representation of the true gospel in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So let's see. So DP Dave just keeps on asking me questions about children being abused in the Catholic Church. I've already commented that that's wrong, that shouldn't be done, and the people who've done that should be punished for that. I don't know what else he expects. I don't even know if he's listening at this point. What does the word say about female pastors? This is a matter of disagreement among Christians. I think that if we read the scripture and historical context, that it's not saying that I think women should be allowed to be pastors. I think it's a mistake by many evangelicals to try to use something like the letters to Timothy to try to justify not allowing women in ministry. I think that's a mistake. If you want a good book on that, there's a book called Two Views on Women in Ministry that presents allows people on different sides of that debate to present their arguments, and I think it's a really great one. I highly recommend that if you're interested in that topic. Also, Craig Keener's book, Paul, Women and Wives, is a really good introduction to that, and he talks a lot about the cultural factors there. Let's see. If God was real, why doesn't he talk to anyone? And people who say they talk to gods are liars. Let's think about what you just said there. If God is real, why doesn't he talk to anyone? Well, there's lots of people who say they have talked to God or that God has talked to them. But then you immediately turn around and you say, well, all those people are liars. Well, it's really easy to maintain your position that God doesn't talk to anyone if anyone who says they've talked to God, you just accuse them of being a liar. So yeah. Let's see, going through the chat, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in there. Someone keeps asking questions about what does the Bible say about female pastors. I just addressed that. I think it's fine for there to be female pastors. I'm not going to repeat what I said there. Yeah, I mean, DP Dave just keeps accusing me of dodging questions that I've answered 2 or 3 times. Let's see. Someone says, show me Christianity in the Bible. What? Read the Gospel of John. Like, the Gospel of John contains all of Christianity. Christ is God. He came to earth. He died. He was resurrected. I mean, those are the core aspects of the Christian faith. You can find that in John. You can find it in the letters of Paul. I mean, some of these questions. Let's see. Can you make some videos proving Christianity is true? I can. So I made a video a while back called like the historicity of the resurrection, an introduction or something like that, in which I pointed people to historical. I outlined historical arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. I mentioned approaches by guys like Andrew Loke, William Lane Craig, Mike Lacona, Gary Habermas, Tim and Lydia McGrew. So like there's different approaches for that. I like William Lane Craig, his work, like The Sun Rises would probably be a good introduction to the historical arguments for Christianity. Like how I would argue for the historicity of the resurrection would be to say, like when we approach the person of Jesus Christ, there are a number of facts that are recognized by the majority of relevant scholars. These are things like Jesus was regarded as a healer, exorcist, and miracle worker in his day. He was crucified at the hands of the Romans. After Jesus' crucifixion, he was buried by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. After his death, a number of his female followers found his tomb empty. And then after Jesus' death, multiple people, both individuals and in groups, started to report that they had appearances of the risen Lord. And then also after Jesus' death, his disciples came to believe that that Jesus had rose from the dead. And they had this sincere belief that they were willing to suffer, and some of them even die for that belief. And so what I would say is like these are facts about the life and death of Christ that are well recognized by the majority of scholars. And some of those facts, the strong, overwhelming, near consensus of scholars would agree with, regardless of their religious affiliation. And I would say that the best explanation for this data is that Jesus rose from the dead. Let's see. Someone said that there's no evidence that God actually exists. Outside of the Bible, there's no tangible evidence. I disagree. The entire field of natural theology and the field of philosophy or religion are arguments for the existence of God outside of any type of divine revelation. I think that we can conclude that gods exist due to the need for there to be a first cause of the universe, as a need for the best explanation for the fine-tuning that we see in the universe, for the grounding of objective moral knowledge and duties, and even for rationality itself. I think that if you don't think God exists, you have a really hard time accounting for how we can have any knowledge of anything. I think there's, so I just mentioned the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, a moral argument, and Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. I'm only mentioning these in brief because I'm only going to be on for another 8 minutes, but I think all of these are good reasons for thinking that God exists, and none of them relies on the Bible. So let's see. Someone says, going through, asking some questions. Someone says historicity is not proof of miracles. I don't even understand what you're saying there. Someone says no religion is right. It's just perspective. I disagree. So, for instance, Jews say that Jesus was not the Messiah. Christians say that he was. These both can't be true. One of these is true. One of these is false. Some of these things have more objective truth value than the others. Someone said, if religion gives people morals, how did morals improve the last 200 years? I think you're misunderstanding the nature of the claim. The claim is that in the absence of God, we don't have a grounding or reasons for thinking we have objective moral knowledge. It is not to say that people's moral compasses can't improve or that it's only through religious revelation that moral improvement can come about. You're just misunderstanding the nature of the argument. Let's see. Someone said thoughts on David Woods. I think David Wood is great. I think he presents good information on Islam. Yeah, so the fact that everyone makes the claim that their religion is backed up by evidence, that doesn't change the fact that some religions actually are more backed up than evidence. That is something that every person, regardless of their view, they think their view has evidence, they think their view is the rational one, and they think people who dissent from them are being irrational. That's just a fundamental aspect of holding to a viewpoint that is different than others. For instance, I think you probably think that your non-religious stance is one that has evidence supporting it. So this accusation here of like, oh, you're making a claim that everybody else claims, yeah, that's just true of any controversial position. Someone said, let's see, where do I find the videos you mentioned? You can either find them on my YouTube or you can find them on my TikTok. Yeah, either one of those. My YouTube is in Philosopher's Garb. It's also linked in my profile. Someone says, show me evidence. I've already mentioned multiple times where I think you can find good evidence for the existence of God and for the historicity of Jesus. Yeah. Let's see. Someone says the Bible is a huge contradiction in itself. I disagree, and I actually also think that this is failing to understand the nature of the Bible, which is a collection of historical documents. It's not one book. Let's see. Someone says, let's talk about slavery in the Bible. I addressed that topic earlier. I think it's funny when people get into a live with me and then they bring up these topics and they think they're being really innovative and they're being really clever, and I've already addressed them like in the first 5 minutes of the live. Someone says, do I believe in ghosts? I'm open to that idea. I'm not sure that I have a firm position on it. Someone said, be holy, religion causes contradiction. I disagree. Someone says, breathe, dude. Nah, I'll breathe in 5 minutes when I get off the live. I'm reading all the chats. Well, I'm reading all the chats that aren't adding somebody else. Someone said, how much caffeine have you had today? About 140 milligrams. Yeah, I have one Monster. That's about it. But that was several hours ago. I'm just trying to go through the chat before I try to get as many questions answered as I can before my next 5 minutes is up. Someone says, can we reunite with the Catholic Church this century? That seems like a question for the Catholic Church. That seems like a question between the respective authorities of the differing churches there. Yeah, so the adversary is just making accusations, calling people names. Jesus never said that there would be... Oh, sorry. Someone said Jesus said there would be false prophets like Muhammad. I agree. Someone said, can you talk about those arguments in detail, please? I can give a brief sketch, but I said I would only be on here for an hour, and I have 4 minutes left. I have spelled out those arguments in more detail in some past videos. I spelled them out in more detail in some of my past lives. I'm trying to think. I made a video responding to Christy Burke. I've had several Christy Burke response videos, and in one of them, I gave a brief outline of something like the Kalam cosmological argument. Yeah, I mean, if I had more time, I would, but like I said, I told my wife I'd only be on here for an hour today, and I'm not going to try to explain the Kalam in 4 minutes. Well, without at least preparation. When I did it in the Christy video, I was able to organize things better. I'm not going to do that on the fly. Someone said science does not start from the belief in God. Well, modern science seems to have as its origin belief in a creator, and this is backed up by historians of science. Someone said most scientists are not Christian. Name them. As far as naming prominent Christian scientists or prominent religious scientists, yeah, sure. Don Page, Alan Sandage, George Ellis, John Sanford, just to name a few, are very prominent scientists. Charles Towns he won the Nobel Prize for Physics in, I think, 1970s, something like that. That's just a handful as an example. The idea that science and Christianity or science and religion as a whole are somehow incompatible is just insane. Someone said God's Philosophers as a book. Yeah, that's a cool book. I read some of it. I just saw that as I was scrolling. What teachings do you agree with that the Mormons have? It depends on what Mormons you're talking to. I mean, Joseph Smith. It's kind of hard to find much agreement with Joseph Smith as he originally taught things, because he thinks there's a God, but he thinks God is not eternal, that he was originally a man on another planet, things like that. Someone says we don't have any record of Christ's words. No, we have 4 first century documents recording Christ's words. I don't understand how people can get on and make such ignorant comments like that. Like, how are you going to say we don't have any record of Christ's words when we explicitly have records of Christ's words that come about within the first century? I mean, it's just insane. Someone said, let's talk about all the horrible things people have done in the name of Christianity. Okay, let's say people have done horrible things in the name of Christianity. Okay, so what? Like, people can use their beliefs to justify bad actions regardless of their worldview. That doesn't affect the truth of a worldview. There are people who have used, there are atheists who have done bad things. Like, I don't use that as an argument against atheism. There are Muslims who have done bad things. I don't actually use that as an argument against Islam. I think Islam is false on other grounds, and I don't point to something like 9/11 to justify my rejection of it. It's a shame that opponents of Christianity can't come up with better arguments than this. Someone said religion helped science create counterclaims to religious beliefs. This is false. The more we study science and the more we study the natural world, the more we see science affirming the idea that the universe began to exist and that it was specially catered to the existence of sentient life like us. Let's see some issue with that, right? If you're fasting because it makes you feel better physically, because it helps you lose weight, things like that, I'm completely fine with that. Yeah, so Simmons said, I've got maybe 1 more minute left. I'm going to scroll through here really quickly and see if anything catches my eyes. Dante Mercy hops in the last 10 minutes of my live, says he sees no real answers, and then wants to make a conclusion off that. Cool. Why don't you hop on to one of my other lives where I bring people on and me and you can chat. I did that yesterday. I didn't do it today because I only had about an hour. Let's see. The point of my live is to answer questions about Christianity, not respond to every, quite frankly, every brain-dead atheist who comes in here with some argument he got off of a Reddit post and tries to throw it at me like he thinks he's being original. Let's see. Any other questions I want to talk about? Someone said, did you already talk about Old Testament slavery? Yeah, I talked about it a bit in the beginning. I'm sure it'll come up in a future live. I just think that colonial chattel slavery that we have in the Western world and the American history is not comparable to the way that to what is depicted in the Old Testament. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna briefly skim through these. I'm gonna jump down, see what some of the last messages were, see if there's a last question, and then I'll bounce. Someone said, did Abraham need Jesus for forgiveness? If so, why was he in heaven at Jesus' time? Yeah, so I think Jesus' death applies to all who have ever lived or ever will live, including those in the past. So it was because of Jesus' death on the cross that Abraham was able to have. It was because of Abraham's faith in God. He was saved by Christ, even though Christ's death wasn't going to come about until much later down the line. So yeah, I think I'll let that probably be my last question, because it's about an hour mark now. I appreciate everyone hopping on. Today was just Q&A. A lot of times in the past, I've had people come on and we've had discussions. I did that in my live yesterday. I'm sure I'll do it again in the future. I just wanted to do a quick Q&A today. So yeah, appreciate everyone hopping on. Feel free to follow me if you want to come into my lives again. And yeah, I'll go ahead and bounce. Thanks, everybody. Whoops. There we go.